Hey, good morning, Austin Oaks. How's everyone doing today? Hope you're doing well. Excited to spend this morning with you. Let's see who's trickling on already. Jenny, first to show up. Good to have you here this morning. Let me just get my Bible set up here. Hey, if you're trickling in, we're going to be in Acts 21 today for our Devo. I'll be reading a little bit from that. You can join us. Good morning, Maggie. We got our faithful ones every morning popping in to see us. Good to see you. Let me know you're here. It's good to have you in this morning. Hey, check it out. Some of you have been in my discipleship training, have seen it, but got some Austin Oaks swag going. This is all new. Got this one down here, Sports and Rec. I'm doing it all today. Sports and Rec, AOC. See it? Austin Oaks. So I'm geared up, ready to roll this morning. What do you got going? Yep, Ginny's stuck in her cubicle, trying to keep things moving. Someone's got to do that, Ginny. Hey, this morning I got a really great Devo for you. Very appropriate. Just amazing how just walking through a book like Acts, how pertinent the principles in the scriptures are to even situations that we're going through right here at the moment. But we're going to look at in Acts chapter 21, look at some of Paul's missionary journeys, as that's where we're at right now, and see just what it took. One of Paul's great callings, and we see this more in Ephesians chapter 2 when he talks about it and expounds on it, but it's played out in the book of Acts, is unity within the people of God. And Paul was very instrumental in breaking down the wall, the dividing wall between Jews and Gentiles, which at that time was kind of the people of God and then everyone else, because they weren't abiding by the law or within the Jewish people. And God had always wanted to break that down, always wanted to be a people or a God of all nations. He just started with the Jewish people, never intended to end with them. It was the Jewish people that got so caught up and internally focused on themselves that they kind of made the rest of the world the enemy instead of the mission, if that makes sense. And so even when Jesus came and did the work that he did as their Messiah, he launched Paul out to be that unifying factor. And so we see that so much in the book of Acts, and we're going to see it here and what it costs for that. So important that we have this proper perspective of who we are as God's people and who we aren't supposed to be. And we're going to see very clearly in this passage the cost of unity, as well as the many ways that we have failed to fulfill that as Christians, even as American Christians, maybe even more so. There's a lot of systemic disunity that's been woven within our culture and a lot of our practices. And sometimes it's out of just sheer ignorance, and other times it's out of kind of our own personal tribalism or just selfish human typical ways in which we act toward others who are different from us or not like us. So let's jump in and read some through this passage and take a look at these principles. Hang on, I'm going to set my coffee cup down here. All right, so Acts 21, we're going to look at the cost of unity. I want you to see a handful of principles of what it really takes to pursue unity, to be a person of unity and a people of unity. And this isn't just true for Acts and the early church. These principles we're going to see are 100% applicable to us today in really every realm. It could be in our workplace, it could be in our home, in our neighborhoods, and in particular in our churches and in our communities. So I'm going to start in verse 15. So this part of the book of Acts, as you can see, is the missionary journeys of Paul. So Paul's been out on several of these missionary journeys. And back in chapter 19, okay, you got to connect this story because all this kind of fits together, but we're just going to focus on part of this story. But in chapter 19, Paul is influenced or impressed by the Spirit to return to Jerusalem. In fact, two things that the Spirit seems to have spoken to Paul. One is he needs to return to Jerusalem, and that's connected partly because of the famine that was going on in Jerusalem, Paul's desire to bring a gift to relieve some of the struggles that were going on in Jerusalem. And now he's calling Gentile believers to give. And we see that in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, when he's challenging the people of Macedonia, and the Macedonians, who are Gentiles, give generously to Paul. And Paul is carrying that gift back to Jerusalem, kind of showing again the unity of the church. Here, the Jews were the ones who, in a sense, brought faith through Jesus being a Jew, and it was shared to the Gentiles. Now the Gentiles are sharing in their riches to help encourage the Jewish Christians who are struggling in Jerusalem. So that's one of the reasons Paul is going back to Jerusalem. The other reason is he's wanting to continue to keep God's people unified. And we see that in Ephesians 2 as he talks about that, one unified people. You just see it as God gave Paul his mission, that whenever Paul went somewhere, he started in the synagogues and then he moved out to the Gentiles from there. So God was never intending to create two different people during this time. It was to be one unified people. And so Paul is holding to that mission. The other thing Paul said in Acts chapter 19 that the Spirit was impressing upon him was not just going back to Jerusalem, but eventually on to Rome, which was the center of the empire or the Western world at that time, knowing that if the gospel could spread there, could spread to just about anywhere in the world. So Paul has a desire to go to Rome as well. And we're going to see, and if you read the story, you're going to see how in God's sovereignty, he uses even the difficult circumstances in Paul's life to accomplish that mission. So here we are, Acts 21. I'm going to start in verse 15. So if you want to follow along, get your Bible app, follow along. I'm going to read this to you so you can catch it. But I'm going to highlight some particular things. So it says, after this, meaning after these different trips, and this is just stages of their trip back to Jerusalem. It says, after this, we got ready and went up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea also went with us and brought us to Mnason of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we were to stay. When we reached Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters welcomed us warmly. The following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard it, they glorified God and said, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law." So here's one of the things that you want to see just internally within this narrative, that Paul, not only in Acts 19, that's where he first gets this impression from the Spirit to go to Jerusalem, but in chapter 19, in chapter 20, and even at the beginning of this chapter, chapter 21, as he's visiting Christians on his way back to Jerusalem, each place, people are telling him that if he goes to Jerusalem, he's going to experience great suffering. It's going to be difficult, and he's being prophesied over that these things are going to happen. And they're urging him not to go, but Paul goes anyways because he understands what his mission is, what his primary purpose is one of God's first apostles, and in particular an apostle to the Gentiles, and one who is to bring unity between the Gentile church and the Jerusalem church, or the Jewish church. And so the first principle we see here is Paul doesn't use his leadership for selfish reasons. He uses it to serve others. And unity requires leaders to sacrifice rather than be served. Paul knew full well, in fact, the Spirit had been telling him through these other prophets that he was going to face some significant persecution in going back. And anytime you're trying to lead a movement of unity, you need to expect to experience some of that as well. Every great movement of unity that's occurred in our country or within the church is always led by a leader who's willing to sacrifice for others rather than seeking to be served and comfortable. And that's so important for all of us. We often want to use our positions of power to serve ourselves or to make ourselves comfortable. And that's often what leads to the disunity that plagues both churches and our nation. Our nation, unfortunately, has done that for many generations. Even as we Anglos moved into the Western world, we often used our positions of power to serve ourselves and to conquer and to push aside those who were in our way, rather than to use our leadership and our power to serve those whom we came in contact with in a gospel-oriented way. And anytime we use our power to maintain power or to protect ourselves from any other threats in an unhealthy way, or to not leverage it to serve others, we are going to create disunity. And a lot of that we see the ramifications of even in our modern days. Second thing we see as we move through this is, so after he reports, they tell him that many Jews have believed as well in Jerusalem and they're zealous for the law. But look at what it says in verse 21. It says, but they have informed about you, meaning these zealous Jews who've become believers and they're zealous for the law. They've informed about you, Paul, that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to abandon Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or to live according to our customs. So what is to be done? They will certainly hear that you've come. So here's I think, an incredibly important principle, and we've seen this throughout the book of Acts several times, is when they inform each other and they get these information, what happens here is these Jewish leaders that Paul's talking with say, hey, there's all kinds of Jews who have become believers. They're zealous still for the law. They still want to practice the law. But they've been informed, or they've heard, that you're teaching Jews. When you go out to these other areas, like Paul's been going on his missionary trips, they've heard rumors that Paul's teaching the Jews in those areas to just disregard the law, to abandon Moses altogether, and not even to circumcise their children according to their own customs. Here's what I think is so important. One is, if you've read the book of Acts and you follow Paul's ministry, that's not what Paul has done anywhere. He's never done that. In fact, in many cases, he's asked people who weren't circumcised, like Timothy, to become circumcised so they could be more effective ministering to the Jews in which Paul was ministering to at that moment. So if anything, Paul went to the other extreme. And as he says, oftentimes, I become all things to all men. If it's a Jew, I become like a Jew. If it's a Gentile, I become like a Gentile. Paul was willing to set aside his own customs, the non-moral issues of his faith, in order to reach those whom he was trying to serve. And one of the things we see here about unity is unity requires seeking truth, not settling for hearsay. What stirs up and what's going to stir up this whole big riot that's about to happen in this chapter is simply this: it's hearsay. People are making decisions based on false truths, false claims. They're doing it based on hearsay. And unity never settles for hearsay. It doesn't say, well, this person told me that that person was doing this. Unity always goes and seeks out the truth from the original sources. It goes to people personally. It doesn't get its information off the internet or off social media from secondhand sources, unless it can absolutely verify them. And that's part of the reason we have even more escalating disunity in our nation, is because people are getting their information from second and third and fourth hand sources that's being passed on, and they're making rash emotional judgments based on things that really aren't necessarily true. We aren't seeking out the facts. And unity withholds its emotional judgments and its intellectual judgments until it actually knows the truth in the situation. And oftentimes it just needs to say, hey, I'm not involved in this situation, therefore I really don't have a say. I just need to remain quiet until I actually know the facts. And it's interesting to watch all that's being communicated during this time, because there are deep truths and deep issues that are needing to be discussed during this time. But a lot of it is unhelpful because it's being based on partial truths or simply hearsay. It's not even based on the facts. It's just people getting worked up and emotional about what they perceive is true or has been told to them by someone, but hasn't necessarily been verified. So they go on to say, so what is to be done? They will certainly hear that you've come. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have made a vow. Take these men, purify yourself along with them, and pay for them to get their heads shaved. Then everyone will know that what they were told about you amounts to nothing, but that you yourself are also careful about observing the law. So what these Jewish leaders here in Jerusalem are doing, these Jewish Christian leaders, they're just telling Paul, go through with a Nazirite type vow. Fulfill it with these 4 men who have taken these vows. Go through and practice these Jewish customs. And what it'll do is it'll kind of put these rumors to bed. It'll show people that you haven't disregarded the law of Moses at all. And it says in verse 25, with regard to the Gentiles who have believed, we have written a letter containing our decision. They should keep themselves from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from what is strangled, and from sexual immorality. So these leaders go back and affirm what they wrote up even back in Acts 15 in the Jerusalem Council, as that's referred to, as Gentiles were starting to become believers in great numbers. They kind of curbed the guidelines and said, hey, here's just some basic practices in our customs that we believe would be helpful to allow even Gentile believers to not have the burden of the law on them, but to have some healthy distinction between them and the world. And so these were the same things. They just reiterate them as in terms of what they said. So they weren't necessarily siding with these zealous Jews and saying, hey, we got to put all the law into practice, and that's what we did before, and just jumping on the bandwagon because people were worked up. They actually stick to their convictions and go with them. And this is something that's really important, and we see it in the book of Acts and unity. Unity requires holding customs loosely in order to hold relationships tightly. That's what unity requires. When we put our customs and our traditions as a higher priority than loving people, we become just like these zealous Jews or the Pharisees who were less about loving people and accomplishing what God had in mind for the salvation of the world. We suddenly make our customs and our traditions an idol. They become an idol that we worship, and we're willing to set aside the mission of God and worship our traditions and customs in such a way that it prevents new people who aren't familiar with those customs, people who maybe even have different customs and traditions, from ever feeling comfortable coming to hear about our God from us. We eliminate ourselves from being effective. And none of this is to say that customs or traditions are bad or wrong. They're just non-moral. They're not the highest priority. And it doesn't mean we have to throw all customs out. That's not the issue at all. Customs are great. Traditions are great. They help us hang on to deeper truths that are associated with them. But sometimes we need to recognize that not everyone has the same traditions we have. Not everyone has the same customs we have. And for the greater good, is it more important that we hang on to our customs and traditions, or that we accomplish the greater mission that God has for us? Because let's face it, all our customs and traditions at best will only last as long as we live on this temporal earth. Compared to the unity that we will have in heaven for all of eternity, the length of our customs are like a blip on the map. So hold them loosely. Hold them loosely in order to hold relationships tightly. In fact, oftentimes what you might find is if you hold them loosely and are even willing to set them aside to enter into a relationship with someone with very different customs and traditions, you'll come to find that a dialogue will ensue that allows you each to share your traditions. And you'll find that those people will sometimes and oftentimes adopt your customs and traditions afterwards, after they hear the whys and even see how much you love them more so than you love your customs and traditions. And you kind of get a both end oftentimes, but that's another discussion for another time. So let's keep going. So it says, the next day, Paul took the men, having purified himself along with them, and entered the temple. Look at how Paul so quickly set aside his own customs in order to seek unity in this situation. Even though the men that were accusing him were wrong and they were acting immaturely, Paul is the bigger man. He's a leader who's willing to sacrifice for the sake of others. And so he follows the council, and he announces in completion of the purification days when the offering would be made for each of them. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd, and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people, our law, and this place." Again, here's hearsay, absolute hearsay. And unity requires we seek truth, not settling for hearsay. So they're stirring people up and telling lies. It says, what's more, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. And then listen what Luke says right after this in verse 29. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him, and they supposed, aka they assumed, that Paul had brought him into the temple. Again, absolute hearsay. You see this over and over in the book of Acts. It just does nothing but create disunity and division. It is so important that we as Christians are truth seekers, and we simply withhold our judgment until we've taken the time to seek out the actual facts. And if we can't get all the facts, then only speak on the facts that we can speak on. Don't make statements that are just purely uninformed or informed by someone else who can't confirm them. It does nothing but create problems. It says the whole city was stirred up and the people rushed together. They seized Paul, dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. As they were trying to kill him, word went up to the commander of the regiment that all Jerusalem was in chaos. Taking along soldiers and centurions, he immediately ran down to them. Seeing the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander approached, took him into custody, and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing and some another. Since he was not able to get reliable information because of the uproar, he ordered him to be taken into the barracks. When Paul got to the steps, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd, for the mass of people followed, yelling, "Get rid of him!" As he was about to be brought into the barracks, Paul said to the commander, "Am I allowed to say something to you?" He replied, "You know how to speak Greek? Are you the Egyptian who started a revolt some time ago and led 4,000 men of the assassins into the wilderness?" Paul said, "I'm a Jewish man from Tarsus of Cilicia, a citizen of an important city. Now I ask you, let me speak to the people." After he had been given permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned with his hands to the people. When there was a great hush, he addressed them in Aramaic. Here's what I think is amazing about Paul. Even after being treated horribly in this situation, total false accusations by people stirring the crowd up, even this military leader that came down to squelch things didn't know the truth. He thought Paul was some kind of an assassin from Egypt who started a revolt a while back and didn't even know that. But Paul responds respectfully. He actually asks, "Hey, may I speak?" He respects his leaders. He expects those in authority, even while at the same time speaking up boldly. Paul models what true resistance looks like. And true resistance is speaking boldly, as we've seen many leaders in our history do this, to take great sacrifice, to risk their own lives, yet do it in a respectful and peaceful manner, while at the same time speaking truth boldly. They weren't pushovers, they weren't weak, they didn't fail to speak about injustices that were happening, but they did so in a way that really demanded people's respect, even if it cost them personally. That's pretty It's pretty amazing to think and not admire a person like Paul, who is experiencing what he experienced and still showed the self-control that he showed. And I think we know many people. One I think that I most admire is Martin Luther King Jr., a man who could speak with such powerful words and yet demonstrate so peacefully and really demand and call that out of his own followers, even when in a worldly sense, they deserved in a worldly sense to act unjustly and cruelly towards others, because for so many years they had been treated with such cruelty. And that's human nature, to respond in kind. We all naturally want to do that. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But powerful leadership that has ongoing impact beyond the life of that individual, will always lead like we see here. That's why Paul had ongoing impact. It's why Martin Luther King has had ongoing impact. A lot of people who fight in the same way the world fights, by returning evil for evil and vengeance for vengeance, they may have a voice for a short time, but rarely do we ever hear any more about them in history. Their time comes and it goes. It's those who pursue unity with these kinds of principles that leave a lasting impact. It's why Jesus ultimately has had the greatest impact of any person in the world, and yet held the lowest of positions of any influential world leader ever. He held no position of power in society at all. He wasn't a great athlete. He wasn't a phenomenal musician and well-known. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't an incredible scientist that made great discoveries. None of the things that we often associate with great influence characterized Jesus. And yet he pursued this kind of unity with a character, with a strength that made his impact last longer than any other person who's ever walked this earth. I mean, just try to name for me one other person who lived over 2,000 years ago that you can even name, much less you can name one thing that he taught us or one principle that he left for us. And yet most people, even non-believers, can tell you many things that Jesus said, what he stood for, because he courageously pursued unity even in these ways. And just like Paul, and Paul really is a shadow of Jesus in this, as he's heading into Jerusalem. He knows he's going to be persecuted, and it's in that persecution that allows him to spread the gospel out to the world. So here's my last point, and I just want to challenge you with a question after this. Unity, true unity, requires trusting the sovereignty of God when our justice doesn't come quickly. Unity requires trusting the sovereignty of God when our justice doesn't come quickly. Sorry, I had a phone call coming through. Anyways, I want to say this because here's what's powerful about this. Paul had every right to fight for his rights here. In fact, later on, we're going to see he actually speaks about being a Roman citizen, and it freaks out these leaders because they have arrested and bound someone who's a Roman citizen and hasn't been fairly tried. But Paul doesn't throw out that card right off the bat. Paul wants to speak. He wants the opportunity to speak, and you'll see that in the next chapter. He gets that with these people, but they still reject him. But Paul trusts the sovereignty of God when he doesn't get justice quickly. In fact, he's about to face a road where he doesn't get justice for many years. He's going to be imprisoned for several years because of this event, and it'll take forever for him to get the justice that he deserves. However, Paul also understands there's a sovereign God behind all these things. So we have to recognize that truth as well, just as Jesus did, that justice did not come about in his own life at that moment he hung on the cross, because he was considering justice for all. He was considering really grace and mercy for all. And so he was willing to put aside his need for personal justice at that moment for the good of everyone. And here's what's phenomenal about this. Paul had been told by the Spirit that he needed to go to Jerusalem and that he was going to have to go to Rome after that. And Rome would have been a hugely influential place for the gospel to be presented and shared by Paul. And so Paul had to think about getting there. He tried a few times and couldn't get there. But interestingly enough, in this situation that we see today, it's going to be the very means by which God brings Paul to Rome. In fact, he brings him to Rome and puts him in contact with people that Paul would normally never have any opportunity to speak to. Paul's going to get to speak to Roman government leaders, the highest people of leadership in that city. He's going to be chained to a Roman centurion, a guard under house arrest. He's going to basically have a house. He's going to have living conditions that aren't great in one sense, but they're paid for. He's literally chained to a guard who is going to have the opportunity to hear the gospel, and people are going to be able to come and visit him. He's going to have almost his own little church in a prison cell, a house arrest prison cell situation, and all of it will be paid for by the Roman government. Like, how amazing is that? And Paul recognized that even in the midst of this, he didn't need to violate the principles that God had given him to fulfill the calling that God had placed on his life. He could recognize, I will speak, I will act within the guidelines God's given me for unity, but when they don't immediately work in my favor, I'll trust the sovereignty of God when justice doesn't come quickly. And Paul has a multi-year ministry to Rome because of it, speaking with people he would have never have been able to have an audience with if he just went there in his own power. Now, what does that look like for us? What does that mean for you and me? I'm going to ask you this. How will you courageously seek unity as you follow Jesus? What are places in your life that you need to have the courage to lay down some customs in order to hold tightly to relationships? Maybe it's with your kids. If you are parents and you're clinging to some things that really aren't that important, and it's pushing away your children and not allowing unity to be part of your family. Maybe it's in your workplace. Maybe it's in your church. Maybe it's in your neighborhood or with some neighbors or other people that you cling so tightly to your customs and your routine and how you do things that it's eliminating you from having the opportunity to have a relationship with someone who needs to hear the gospel from you. What would that look like? Can you trust that God's got this justice thing under control? And in particular, if you're a person who's in the majority, like many of us are, who have been in the accepted group of society, it's up to us to be the ones who start the sacrifice, who take the step and use our position to serve others and to love others, and even at great cost, like Paul did, to possibly sacrifice and suffer for the sake of others, and do so in a way that communicates the gospel physically, emotionally, spiritually, in every single way. Will you trust God that he's giving you a voice, he's given you a position, and he's giving you the opportunity to courageously trust him as you share the gospel, just like Paul did, just like we see in this story. So I want to encourage you, church. Unity is very costly. It's not just something we throw around and say that we want. It's going to cost you dearly, but it'll be the sweetest gift you'll ever receive once you see it happen. In fact, you and I and most of us would not even be here today, would not even be considered part of the church if Paul hadn't had the courage, as many of those early leaders, to pursue unity with the Gentiles, even against the great persecution he faced from the Jewish people who wanted to keep it all to themselves. Think about that for a moment. You and I would not have heard the gospel if someone hadn't courageously crossed that gap against great persecution, just as we see here with Paul. The question is, are there people in our city who are in the same spot? Are we willing to do for others what's been done for us? Will we pursue unity at all costs? Church, I'm praying for you. I'm super thankful for you. Excited to have you here. And good to see you all. Good to see your names. Jenny, wake up. Come on. You're using that slang, aren't you? Thanks, Chad. From Gary, good to see you, Gary. Loved your guys' again. Psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs each night. You're phenomenal, just how you're setting that up. You're making the rest of us who are on video daily look bad, Gary. I'm just saying that. I know you're doing that in absolute love, though. So, and Sally, good to see you as well. I hope y'all have a wonderful weekend. Oh, my alarm. Yes, that was my phone. Sorry. And love you all. Glad to have you here. I hope again to see you next week. We'll be back on at our usual times. Y'all have a fantastic week. We will hopefully see you virtually on Sunday. If you haven't already, check out a home site. It came in the email on Wednesday. It's on our website. You can check it out. Go worship with a few other brothers and sisters in Christ. And we would love to see you gathering together safely, smartly, and gospel driven as we do that. Y'all have a great week.